In this lecture, we're going to take a more focused view of statistical hypothesis testing. And by definition of the hypothesis is that it is a declarative statement predicting a relationship between an independent variable and the resulting dependent variable specific to a unique population. And there are two types of hypotheses. The first is termed the research hypothesis, which states that the researchers, which is a statement regarding the researchers' true expectations of the results that's guided by the outcomes and the conclusions. And this is very specific to the field of study, that a researcher would conclude or at least generate the hypothesis based upon the particular field's state of knowledge. The null hypothesis is also referred to as the statistical hypothesis and is a statement that will allow statistical testing of the data once data have been collected as part of a research study. So it does not depend on the particular field of study. The alternative hypothesis is the opposite statement to the null hypothesis. And so if we start this out, the null hypothesis symbol is always H with a subscript of 0. The alternative hypothesis goes by the symbol capital letter H with a subscript of 1, or HA, A indicating alternative. And to illustrate the statement of the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, we're going to investigate an example here. And in this example, the interest is comparing intelligence scores between young and older adults. And so to carry out this study, a sample size of 20 young adults will be measured for intellect, a measure of intelligence, and a sample size of 20 of older adults will be assessed the exact same way. And both samples will represent their respective populations, and so the characteristics and the inclusion criteria for participants to be grouped within the young adult must be specific to that portion or that age range of young adults to which the conclusions are to be inferred to, and the same approach must be taken with the older adults as well. And so by extending this study and both groups representing their respective populations, we would generate a research hypothesis. And the generation of a research hypothesis will depend upon various factors to the research question. So the physiology or neuroscience related to aging, the validity of intelligence measurements. These are just some examples of various elements that would lead a researcher to hypothesize what the outcome of the study might be. And so once a statement of the research hypothesis might be measures of intelligence will be different between young and older adults based upon an understanding of the effects of aging on intelligence. Now, if we then move on to the statistical or the null hypothesis, the null hypothesis is always going to be stated in the exact same way across all research studies. And in this example here, we see that the null hypothesis is going to be stated as the average value of the population of young adults will equal to the average value of the population of old adults. And even though the study is focused on two samples, the objective of the study is to be able to use the statistics to infer back to the respective populations, which is why the population symbols are used in the null hypothesis statement. And the average value for each group here is the average value for the intelligence scores as obtained. Another statement, another way to state the null hypothesis is that by transposing the average value of the population for the older adults to the left-hand side of the equation, that the difference in intelligence scores mathematically would be 0. Once the null hypothesis is stated, and the null hypothesis indicating 0 is always stated the same way, regardless of whatever research hypothesis has been stated. The alternative hypothesis is the opposite here. And so the opposite of the scores of the young adults equaling that of the old adults will be stated opposite to that, in that it will not equal. The scores of the young adults will not equal the scores of the older adults. Transposing the right-hand side of this equation to the left-hand side indicates that the difference in the intelligence measures between young adults and older adults will not equal 0. This is what we call a non-directional alternative hypothesis. And the non-directional alternative hypothesis does not specify which direction the difference will occur. It only states that there will be a difference between young adults and older adults, and does not specify which one will be greater than the other. The directional hypothesis or directional hypotheses are generated if the researchers have a reasonable expectation that one group will be greater than or less than another group. So if we follow through with these statements, once again, we start with the null hypothesis, and we state the null hypothesis as stating that the average intelligence scores of the young adults will equal that of the older adults. And notice that the indication of a non-directional or directional hypothesis is never played out in the null hypothesis statement. It is always indicated in the alternative hypothesis. And so what we would state here, if the researchers had a reasonable expectation on direction, we might state that the alternative hypothesis states that the intelligence scores for the young adults will be greater than the older adults, suggesting that the difference between the two will be greater than 0, or that the scores of the young adults will be less than the older adults, and stated alternatively that the value will be less than 0. So relatively it will be a negative value, since the old adult value will be greater than that of the young adults. And so just to summarize this brief lecture here, the null hypothesis is always stated the same way, in that there will be no difference between the two groups. And in stating the alternative hypothesis, the researchers must decide on whether to state it directionally or, on the slide 17, non-directionally. And this ends this brief lecture on an introduction to hypothesis testing.